everybody. We're going to talk about wildlife gardening today and all the different things you can do to improve the quality of the area you've got outside. And some of you might have big gardens and some of you might just have windowsills, but there's always something you can do to encourage wildlife and help it at a time when the numbers of all the creatures out there are dropping. So let's go ahead and have a think about what we're going to do. Sorry, it's my computer's now decided it doesn't want to behave.
Just click on the black border, Caroline, before you try to move it. There.
Okay, we're there. So what can we do to start off with? Well, probably one of the things you could do is just at this time of year is have a chat with the people in your group, have a look round the garden and think, what does it look like now? How can we improve that? So I've just noted down a few ideas initially that you can easily do just to improve the facilities for your wildlife. So one of the things is not to be too tidy in the garden or outside space. People tend to want to chop down dead branches, dead stems at this time of the year, but don't. It's much better if you leave everything as it is, unless it's really a terrible mess and soggy or it looks awful. Just leave the old stems and the old seed heads, the old flowers that are there, or any fruit that's still on your trees or shrubs, because that's going to be really useful for wildlife over winter. So they've got places to hide or food for birds. So don't be too tidy. Enjoy looking at plants as they go through the seasons, and one of the seasons is the winter. We can also provide special places for animals to overwinter. So I'll be telling you about what we can build very easily just to give creatures a secure place to protect them from the cold of the winter and predators as well. What else can we do? Well, we could provide food and water. And what I mean by that is we can provide bird food, which is a very simple thing to do. And we've got activities which we can do about that. And if you haven't got water in the garden, there's all sorts of ways of bringing in water, which can be used for bathing, for feeding, for swimming, all sorts of things. So we'll go into that. The other thing is to grow the sort of plants that the pollinators or the insects are attracted to and want to get the nectar from. Some of the garden plants that have now been developed are too complicated and it's quite difficult for insects. So we'll talk about some of the plants that we can use, or maybe pat ourselves on the back because we've got some of the right plants in the garden anyway. What else can we provide? Places for birds to nest, or we can put bird boxes out, and places for birds to perch so they feel safe and secure while they're perhaps looking for some food around the garden. The other thing that we can do is learn to love weeds. People tend not to like dandelions or nettles, but actually these are things which provide food, especially dandelions come quite early in the season, so they're a good source of nectar for bees, and nettles are particularly good because they serve as a food source for some caterpillars and so on. So if we can learn to love weeds and perhaps call them wildflowers instead. A weed is only a plant in the wrong place. So maybe what we can do if we have a big nettle patch is just to keep some of the nettles in an area, yes, away from people so they don't get stung by the leaves, but we know that they can be useful. So we have to have a different thought about how we treat weeds and what we think about them. And of course, to become organic, which means basically that we're not using anything artificial on the garden. So we're not using artificial chemicals. People up to now have used things to kill weeds, to get rid of insects, like greenfly, for instance. But if we have a well-balanced space or garden or pot, we can use the creatures that come into it to perhaps kill off the pests that we don't really want, like greenfly. So those are some things we can just think about doing without spending any money initially. We'd just be able to look around our garden and have a look and just see what's there. So this picture is a sort of ideal picture of a garden which has been taken over into being a wildlife garden. Now, of course, we don't all have spaces like this that we can have all the things within it. But maybe what it'll do is just give us an idea of what we can do with some parts of the spaces we have. So it shows you some small trees around the edge, some mixed hedging, a meadow grass, a normal lawn, but on the edge is a meadow. So that's really good for wildflowers within the meadow. It's got a pond because water is really important in a garden. There are climbers which cover the outside of the fences and in which creatures can hide or feed from the nectar from the flowers. It's got a bird feeding table. Bird feeding is really important. And lots of flowers for pollen and seed. But I know that most of us don't have a space that we can do all of that in, but perhaps what we can do is just think about which bits of it can we take away and improve and build for the future. So maybe what we could do is have some small small trees on the edge of our plots, either in the ground or possibly in containers. So there are native trees, and what I mean by native is that they've evolved in the UK or in Northern Europe so that our birds and our insects have adapted to live on them. That's the best ones to have. And some of those are the rowan, crabapple, hawthorn, and you know that those flower in the spring and then have fruit hanging off them in the autumn. So they provide flowers with nectar for the insects and bees and fruit for the birds. And they also give us pleasure. They're not huge trees, so we could manage to fit them in quite a small place. So we can put them, as I said, either in the ground or we can plant them in pots, gradually increasing the size of the pot as the tree itself grows. Now, you might think, oh, that's too expensive. I can't afford to buy a small tree. Well, a lot of charities such as the Woodland Trust and the conservation volunteers have times when they offer free small young trees. And when I say small, they're probably about 12 inches, 30 centimeters tall. So they're very, very young, but they're free and they're ready for growing on. And you could put them into a pot. They give you all the details with the small sapling. They'll give you all the details about how to look after it. And you could grow it gradually, and see it growing into a larger tree as time goes on. So they're really worth contacting the Woodland Trust and the conservation volunteers. I know that they are offering these small young trees at the moment in different places here in Edinburgh through our local council nursery. If you contact them, they'll tell you. If you have a bigger plot, they will also offer more than one. They'll offer you several of these small trees. So that's a great fun for having an activity which is planting them up into pots initially, perhaps measuring their height. Then as next year comes, you can plant them in a slightly bigger pot, measure how big they're growing. So that's a great sort of activity for the group to see them and see them through the seasons until they're big enough to put either in the garden or in larger pots. So that will save you some money. If you have lots of money in your group, you can buy a lovely big tree instead. What else? Hedging and shrubs. We saw that there was some in that garden plan before. And it's often a good idea to have a hedge rather than just a fence or a hedge in front of a fence, because what it gives the wildlife in the garden is places to hide, places to have nests, insects to be sheltered from predators. So if you have the space and thought, well, maybe we could plant, and again, they can be planted very, very young, very, very reasonably priced, or as I said, even free through some of these charities. You can have a row of different sorts of, again, native, so plants that have evolved to work with the birds and the creatures in the garden. You could have a row of those mixed up. So some examples, and I've got pictures of them there: hawthorn, which gives you these flowers in the spring, and then haws, which are little berries, if you like, in the autumn as well. Dog rose is another nice rose, and blackthorn, which is, again, gives you fruit in the autumn and flowers early in the spring. And what you notice when you're looking at these pictures is that all the flowers are quite simple, open flowers. They're not complicated double petals, very complicated flowers. And that's what makes them really good for insects and pollinating insects, because the insects can go directly into the center of the flower to obtain the nectar, to take the pollen on their bodies and so on. And that's what makes them really useful plants and flowers. Now, you might say, but hawthorn's a tree, or blackthorn will become a tree. Well, they would if you left them, but obviously if they're in a hedgerow, you can clip them. So they will stay small and really benefit the garden. But of course, a hedge needs quite a lot of space. So if you don't have that space, you could perhaps decide you're going to put a blackthorn in a pot, in a container. And so you again you can keep it clipped as you would do a hedgerow, but it gives you the opportunity of having some of these plants, which are native plants and really good for wildlife and attractive in their own right, which always helps. Other plants that you can use are more plants that you probably know better in a garden setting and you've seen in the nurseries, or you might have some in the space that you've got. But some of these other plants, which aren't native, so they're brought to this country, they're perfectly hardy, perfectly fine, but they've come from, say, Mediterranean places or different places in the rest of the world. But what they provide often is nectar, food for insects, bees, and so on, at slightly different times to the ones that we have that are native. So they'll kind of extend the season and give the opportunity. If it's a bright, sunny spring day, some of the flowers won't be out yet for bees, but some of these ones will be. So I've shown a picture here of heather on the top left-hand side in a pot with other plants decoratively. And heather, of course, does grow in this country. So that's a great one for attracting bees especially, and looks attractive and very easy to get wherever you go to a garden centre. The white one with the bees showing on it is called Pieris. And again, that's very popular in Scotland because it likes our slightly acidic soil here. And that will give you a spring flower, which bees love. Other ones are buddleia. You can see a butterfly, sometimes it's called the butterfly bush. And there in the picture, there's a butterfly on it. And that's a fantastic, vigorous, attractive plant that never gets damaged by insects or problems like that. It probably only would get damaged in high winds, but otherwise, buddleia is a fantastic plant. And once you've got one, you can take cuttings of it, hardwood cuttings in the autumn, and make plants for a year later. So it's a great plant to buy. It's really economical to buy. It loves, as do most of these plants, sunny spots. So you wouldn't put it in shade, it wouldn't do terribly well, nor would the other plants that I'm showing you here. They're good in really sunny spots, and that means that the butterflies and so on are attracted to them. And a buddleia will flower in the summer months, particularly. It will be a shrub. It can grow as big as 3 meters, 4 meters high, but you can prune it easily in the spring, and it will come again and flower again and be fantastic. So a buddleia is a great thing, a great plant to have for butterflies especially, which we want to attract. The next photo down there is, I've gone completely blank. Why have I gone blank?
Lavender.
Lavender, thank you. Looked at it and thought, what's that? Lavender, of course it is. Lavender. Lavender is wonderful again for bees and butterflies and so on. The only problem with lavender is we have a very harsh winter, or you're in an area where you get a really strong frost or frost pocket. I think you'd have to protect it slightly because it is a Mediterranean plant. So it's, although it is hardy, it's not hardy to very, very cold conditions. But if you can grow it and put it in a sheltered spot, or if you have it in a pot, perhaps bring the pot in somewhere where you can slightly shelter it into the winter. It's wonderful for bees and butterflies. It's beautifully scented, which is nice, but you can take cuttings of it in the summer. So you can go on keeping, you could keep those indoors just in case your outdoor plants died. You can buy them small, or with your cuttings, you could have them in a window box. So if you didn't have much space and you only had room on windowsills, well, why not fill some of those up with lavenders and other plants as well? So you're still having the attraction to the bees and the butterflies, but they're small enough for you to have it. And I think I need to say that you need to go for English lavender, not French lavender. French lavender has a slightly different shaped flower. It almost looks like rabbit's ears, but that's really not tender at all. So it's our normal lavender that we have in this country, and we can grow quite easily. And as I say, we can take cuttings. You'll also notice that a lot of the colours of the plants we've got there are bluey purple, and it's been proved that bees are particularly attracted, and butterflies, to blue and purple colours. Also orange and yellow are good. Butterflies have a wider range of colours they get attracted to, but bees particularly, whites, blues, purples, those colours are great. So that's worth remembering when you're choosing some plants, to think about what colours would be the best ones to appeal to bees. So what else can we grow? Well, we can grow wildflowers, which are shown there either in a pot, perfectly fine to grow them in a pot, or grow them in a much bigger border if you're lucky enough to have enough space. These we would grow from seed, although you can buy them as plants, but they're much more expensive. So you can get seeds and sow them annually. Wildflowers tend to be annual plants. So that means they grow in 1 year, flower, die down, set seed, then die down, and they don't come back again. But what you can do, of course, is collect the seed. So wildflower mixes are fantastic because you can get a range of different sorts of flowers which appeal to different sorts of insects. You can obviously, amongst the wildflowers, have plants which have good seed heads. So that's great for birds and provide nesting material later on. But you must remember the wildflowers must be sown or grown in a container in the sunniest part of the garden, or on your sunny window ledge if you've got that area to use, because they won't do well in a shady spot. And I think sometimes people are disappointed because they haven't grown very well. And I think you really need to have them somewhere nice and hot and sunny, and then you get the best of the flowers. So you can get wildflowers, seed, packets of seed, basically from any garden centre you like. And I've mentioned that Scotia seeds produce seeds which are grown in Scotland. So we know they're hardy enough. And they provide seeds which you can get for certain situations. So if you're by the sea, so the bottom picture shows plants that are by the sea, you will get a different selection of seeds than you might for a meadow inland, or one near a more hilly area where you've got thinner soil. And that means that they're going to be more successful when you sow them. You can, of course, try packets of wildflower seeds that you get free with magazines, or you get them in garden centres, because they're probably going to be cheaper to buy. And they're probably fine in garden pots and so on, and maybe fine in the ground. But it's always good to get the best you can. And if you get seed mixes for your particular site and your particular soil, you're probably more successful. But the packets of wildflower seeds are out there, and they're wonderful to grow. You can either sow them directly into the ground if you cleared an area of anything else that's around. So you can grow them below trees or around shrubs and so on, or in a nice sunny bed on their own. Or you can grow them in pots. Now, you would have to grow them not in the winter, but perhaps after March. You could, if you had somewhere like a greenhouse or some polytunnel or a protected area, grow them in pots as you would any other plants. On multi-purpose seed would be fine. Soil, sorry, would be fine. But you need to read on the back of the packet of the seeds exactly what is recommended, and that's always the best way to go. So you can get ahead of yourself if you do want to grow them in pots or in trays indoors, and then be able to pop them up outside. But they can be sown directly on the ground, so you don't need to go through all that if you would rather just what we call broadcast, which means scatter them on some nice, clear, weeded ground. And then stand back and make sure that they're well watered, and you keep watering them as the weather's dry. So, as I've said, most of these wildflowers are annuals. So they go through being beautiful and colourful, and then as August comes, you begin to see that the seed heads are beginning to show. And this is when you can collect seeds. And there's a very nice trellis fact sheet telling you how to make an origami seed packet. So you can collect them and put them in your seed packet, on which you have written what they are. So it might be just a meadow bits. You may not be sure what they are, but perhaps you could get a guide to the different flowers and have a look. And that would be an activity, would be looking up the different colours and what they are and what they might be. So if you can collect them at the end of the summer and store them somewhere dark and dry, you can use those seeds to sow again the following year. So once you've spent money on your first pack, hopefully you'll be able just to produce them from your own flowers. The other thing that often happens, and you could do it, is the seeds will just drop from the plant as it dies onto the ground. And so the seeds are now in the soil. So that's something you can watch out for and see if they grow the following year. In fact, often if I've grown foxgloves, once they've gone over and you've just got a long seed head, I will cut the seed head off and just shake it all over around the garden so that the seeds just spread like that. And they don't need any special way of germinating or anything. They're absolutely fine. So it's a fun thing to do, and it's a great thing if you can keep some sort of calendar or some sort of diary. You could note down when you sowed things, when you first saw them coming up, when did they come in flower. It's nice to be able to see what happens in the garden, see how it progresses as well. And at the same time as doing that, you could have a journal where you perhaps decide you're going to note down, you're going to sit down, watch, and note down how many insects came to them. And what were the insects? Were they bees or butterflies or hoverflies? What was happening? So other plants, as I said, you can grow for their seed heads, which are very useful and attractive in the garden. So I think gardens should look nice as well as being great for wildlife. So what seed heads do is that often the seeds that they produce are food for birds, who you'll see the tall picture is called a teasel in here, my pictures on the screen. And you often see birds picking out the seeds in teasels, but also they'll use them for material for their nests in the spring. And insects might well hide within the different parts of the dead seed head. So I've got a picture of a teasel, which is a wonderful one. And you may have it growing in other people's gardens, and you can just get a seed head and shake it in the area or collect the seeds from them. I'm sure people would love to share their seeds with you. What other ones can we grow? Well, wild carrot, which is the top picture with the white flowers. So there are the seed heads going over, and there are the white flowers still there. You don't get a carrot, but you do get a lovely seed head. And they're really attractive, and again, nice for you, really useful for birds' materials. And at the bottom is burdock. So again, these lovely spiky seed heads from burdock. The other thing that can happen with seed heads is when they get frost on them, they're really beautiful. And that might be great for perhaps a photography session. And people have their cameras on their phones, and they could take pictures of them, or go out and spot what plants look particularly good with the frost on them. And then all these plants you can cut down after the spring. Once the spring is over, you can cut them down or take them out of the ground, chop them up, compost them, and as I said, sow again, or new plants will come up from the seeds that they've dropped. But they are particularly attractive, and I think really important to have seed heads, as well as the beautiful flowers, to have these seed heads, which will provide so much as well. What other flowers should we have? Some of the ornamental plants that you grow, like dahlias, which you might have grown in your garden from tubers. Now, some dahlias are really complicated flowers with double flowers. You can't even see the center. If you want to have them for wildlife, have one like this dahlia, which is lovely and attractive, but you can is open, so it's very attractive to insects because they can see directly where they can go and get nectar and pollen. Foxglove's another lovely plant to have, very easy to manage as well. Bees will go into the tube and get the nectar and the pollen, so it pollinates it as well. Very simple flowers for insects and bees and so on to access. The other picture I've got is cosmos, and I think we did a session before about beautiful flowering plants for the summer, and cosmos was one of them. And they're really successful plants to grow from seed just for the fun of it, because they look so lovely, and they flower actually for quite a long time into the autumn. But they will also provide nectar and pollen for insects and bees. So you don't have to just have what we call wildflowers, which are native to Britain. You can have other flowers, but they should be, as these illustrations show, sort of simple open flowers, which will make it easy for the birds to access, or the bees and the insects to access, and they're colourful and fun too to have in the garden. Now, what else do we think about in the garden? Well, if you've got a lawn, if you've got a big enough area to have a lawn, which you just mow in the normal way, you might want to think again about how you manage your lawn so that you can get flowers within the grass, which is lovely. And you may have heard of No Mow May, which is promoted by lots of charities as a way of encouraging us not to mow too often, and to give the wildflowers, which may have seeds within the soil, a chance to grow, because every time you mow, you're cutting off the heads of them. So the idea of No Mow May is to not mow, finish mowing in the autumn, then not mow again until after May or the end of May. And this way, it gradually, if you do it every year, gives the wildflowers within the lawn that are naturally in there a chance to flower and grow up. You can even if you're brave enough, go on till July, which gives an even longer period, and then cut it all down or mow it down then. And if you've got a big enough lawn, if you wanted to have access, you just mow a path through the longer grass and the flowers that are there. But it's a great way of allowing things like daisies, buttercups, and sometimes orchids, if you're really lucky, a chance to grow without being constantly mowed off and not allowed to grow. So it's a wonderful thing to do. And again, it gives you a chance to keep an eye what's growing up. You can go out and have a look in May. What's come through? Have you got daisies? Were you lucky? You know, you can make all sorts of, you could perhaps pick some of the daisies or some of the other flowers and press them and see what you have every year. So there's lots of fun to do if you've got a meadow grass. Obviously, if you haven't, you can sow in big enough containers meadow grass mixtures, but obviously it's a little more difficult to manage, but it's possible and it's worth trying. So what else can we do? Well, water in the garden, really important for all wildlife, be it insects that still come down and want water, or birds, the obvious thing, or other creatures, frogs, all sorts of creatures, hedgehogs if you're lucky, to get water. So the obvious thing is to have a wildlife pond, which you would dig out and line and so on, and that's fantastic. But most of us don't have the space or the ability perhaps to do something as big as that. So I've just talked here about how we can get water into the garden without having to make a huge effort and make it something we can actually manage. So you can have what's called a mini pond. And it's something I've done lots of times in people's gardens, where you get a container, and obviously it has to be a container which can hold water and it doesn't go through. And you can either dig a hole and lower it into the ground, and then I'll talk about what we do after that, or you can have it above the ground if you don't have a space to do that, as the second photo shows you. And still put some plants in it, which will keep the environment growing and the water pure. And it will still attract dragonflies, hoverflies, birds coming in, so that they're able to get water. And it's a wonderful way of doing it. There are lots of, the picture that I've got, the diagram of how to do it is from the Scottish Wildlife Trust. But there are many different organisations who can tell you lots of information. In this case, they've just got an old bucket. I would say the bigger you can get it, the better, frankly, because it gives more space for the habitat. But a big old bucket could do. You dig a hole, you put some sand in the bottom of the hole to balance your bucket, and you fill in around it with soil so it's stable. And what you do is you make sure that you put in enough bricks, stones, rocks, whatever you can, so that there is a sort of passageway. You can see the picture of the frog. So it means that creatures that go in don't get stuck in, they have a method of getting out. And often it's a good idea to just overlap the edge of any container that you've got in the ground with some other stones, with perhaps some turf leaning into it again, so it gives any creatures that are in somewhere to be able to get out. You will have to put some plants in, you can't just leave it like that. So there are plants called oxygenators, which put oxygen into the water and stop it going bad. The bigger the container you've got, the more plants you can go in. So if you look at the barrel that's on the half barrel that's on the right hand picture, there's some carrots, there's some sort of leaves coming up, there's even, I think looking at it, a very dwarf lily in there. So there's lots of very small plants that you can put in. You just need to make sure that anything you put in is only suitable for a small space and not a huge lily that's going to grow feet across. But the more things like that, the better it will be, the more it will attract creatures in. So water's fantastic in the garden, but even having that might be too much for you. You don't have the space or the possibilities of doing it. So even just a bird bath will help. And it doesn't have to be a special bird bath that you spend a lot of money on. You can use any sort of shallow containers. So it could be, you know, the saucers that you put big pots on. You can get saucers, which you can see the size against the birds in the image, so that there's somewhere you can put the water, but it's not too deep, so the birds can sit on the edge. If you find you've got a container that's about more than 4 inches deep, so 10 centimeters, 4 inches deep, if it is deeper than that, that's okay. You can still use it. You just pile up some rocks or some bricks so that there's almost an island in the middle, so that birds can land on that and then take water and so on. In this situation, you don't need to bother about putting plants in because it's just not deep enough to do that. But it is deep enough for birds to wash themselves, to drink, for other insects to come and go and get water. It needs to be put somewhere that's not midday sun because it gets too hot. So somewhere that's open but reasonably shaded. Also, I wouldn't put it onto the ground directly because when the birds come, there might be predators trying to catch them. So if you raise it up a bit, either on a pile of bricks, or you might have a plinth somewhere or a little low table, then it means it's up and the birds are safer there. So all you have to do with something like that is just to remember it on warm summer days to fill it up. And if you can fill it up with rainwater, which you've caught in a container, so much the better. Or if you're using tap water, just put the tap water into a container and leave it outside for a day, just so any chlorine or anything else evaporates and it's nice soft water that you can put in. And so you top it up in the summer, and the water still needs to be there as the year goes on. So you just free the ice if there's ice on it. But it gives you a possibility of sitting back and seeing what birds come. And you can make notes about that, or take photos of them, or draw them, and you can keep a track and learn about birds at the same time, hopefully. If you want birds in the garden, you really need to feed them as well. Obviously, they'll feed off the insects or the green fly. So you can get lots and lots of bird feeders from every outlet, shops or wherever, to hang in trees. But if you haven't got the possibility of hanging it in trees, you could get one of these ones which fit onto the glass of your windows. And birds do come to them, and it gives you the possibility of sitting indoors and look at the birds arriving. And that's great, especially if you've got people in your group who aren't really able to go outside, that they can sit and watch the birds as they come. You will still need to someone will need to put the food in them, and they will need to be cleaned from time to time, but it's a great way of being able to observe the birds and not have to be outside, because that's not always possible, or you don't have the space. But these are available. They're not too expensive either. But what bird seed are you going to use? Well, the best bird food for small birds are seeds, all the different seeds that are around, flaked maize, peanut granules they like. Obviously, you can get it can get more complicated if you decide you want certain food for certain birds, but maybe at first you just want to get a mixture, which is a general mixture for most things. Avoid some of the mixtures where they put a lot of wheat in, or lentils or beans. Wheat is a sort of packing out mixture, and it's actually not that beneficial for birds, in the way that we don't now feed birds with bread in the garden, or when we go and feed ducks, it's not the right thing for them. So if you can, try and find good quality bird seeds, and avoid the larger things in it, because that encourages large birds. And what we want to do perhaps is to feed the smaller birds more. Another way of putting out feed, especially in the winter, is fat balls, which you can make. You can buy. They're a fatty mixture into which all those seeds are going. You can see someone making one there. It's quite a fun thing to do if you haven't done it before. So it's a great group activity. There's a trellis fact sheet which tells you about how to make some. And of course, the fat won't melt in the winter. Not so useful in the summer when it gets hot, but it's a great way. And then those can go into either a hanging bird feeder or different things that you can put it out in. But there's plenty of information out there to tell you about it. But if you're feeding the birds, try and keep feeding them all year round. You don't see them so much in the winter, but there are still birds there and they still need feeding. So don't forget about them in the winter. What else can we do? We can do hidey holes or places for creatures to hide themselves away safely. I talked about not cutting plants down and leaving stalks and things for them to stay in, but also, so dead plant stems are very useful, but we can do other things. We can make a log pile, great for beetles, great for animals to hide in, little mammals to hide in. So if you're doing any pruning, you could cut all the prunings up or the logs you've got and push them into a quiet, sheltered corner. And that's a great, simple place for animals to hide, especially in the winter. And you've probably also heard about bee hotels, which are for bees that are solitary bees, not bees that are in hives. And they like to be alone. And you can cut canes, bamboo canes, quite hard to cut, but they can be cut with secateurs or with a little saw, longer than 15 centimeters, which is 6 inches, because if it's any less than 6 inches, other creatures can easily get in to get them, as it were. So slightly longer than that. Put them in a plant pot and then put the plant pot on its side, as you can see this one is. So any old plant pot will do. Then place it on some rocks or some stones and lean it on its side. That way, the rain, any rain that comes down can escape, so it doesn't get soggy and horrid. And then it can be put in a sort of sunny spot, and these solitary bees can make a home in it. So that's a great one. Again, you can buy very fancy ones if you want, but this is a great way of just doing it yourself. So how do you find out about all these things? Well, there's lots of trellis fact sheets. So making a wildflower meadow is one, making a mini pond, feathered friends fat pots, that's those fat seedy feeding. Cheesy fruit kebabs might not sound like something for birds to feed on, but it is. So don't be put off, it's not cookery. So there's lots of trellis fact sheets out there on our site. Scotia seeds, I've put the address there because they're quite useful to look at and have a look at the different mixtures that they do. Where else can you get information? Scottish Wildlife Trust, particularly good. They've got lots of very good learning resources and so on. The RHS, if you go onto them, the Royal Horticultural Society, lots of information on wildlife gardening, resources for schools and so on. And the Woodland Trust, as I mentioned, for free small trees, so don't forget about those. They also have lots of learning resources. So there's masses out there, and I wish you luck, and I'm sure that you will be doing your best to look after all our wildlife and have as many there as possible.
Thank you very much, Caroline.
Pleasure.
Absolutely packed with lots of information about pollinators and birds and
absolutely
bugs and mammals and amphibians. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. That's just amazing.
Right.
So I think there's just like a million ideas we could go away and try. And I love the way it started with just actually looking at what you've got at the moment. Look around and see what's there and assess what you have, and just look at it with an eye to wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's just a terrific way to start it, isn't it? And then you can build on that.
Exactly. And you don't have to do it all at once.
No.
You could just think, oh, that would be a good project. I'll make a mini pond or just some bird feeders. I mean, anything helps in the garden. and will be
Absolutely.
fun so that you can sit back and look at what's coming in too.
Absolutely. Well, this is a point where we can open up to everyone in the group. If you have any comments or you have any questions, or perhaps you'd like to share some experiences that you've had trying to bring wildlife into your gardens, and that would be lovely. Please feel free to unmute and have a chat with us. That'd be great. Eileen, I don't know how much gardening you get to do or what you've tried. I wonder if you've tried anything to attract wildlife into your garden in the States.
Um, well, I live in Missouri, which is in the center of the United States, and I call gardening my full-time job, because I spend so many hours outside. I have a unique space. It's 2 acres. It was almost all lawn and invasive species like bushes around the edges. And so I call it rewilding or naturalizing
Yeah.
because I have a severe deer problem, white-tailed deer. They're native, but their habitat and predators have been taken away. So they eat a lot of the native plants. So I do leave a lot of debris. It's more like you would see out in nature here
Mhm.
that I'm mimicking in my yard because it helps me with protecting seedlings. I don't trim old growth off of much unless it's a danger because it also helps keep the deer away from the new growth. I have to use a lot of caging and protection, but I also double it up. There's an author, Doug Tallamy, in America that kind of talks a lot about how to naturalize your yard. So I'll do like a tree, a bush, and flowers, and maybe something else at the bottom of a cage. So then it's multi-layered growing in there. I'm a big fan of insects and what they do. So I leave debris for them too. When I throw a log by a tree, I call it giving it vitamins. Um, I like the water feature idea of a buried pot because I've wanted to put one in, but haven't done that yet. I order seedlings from our Department of Conservation each year, so they're, anywhere from 4 inches to 12. And then I do a lot of them. So it's like some for me, some for the deer, some for I forgot where I put them and they're gonna die. I did change careers from being an occupational therapist and now I'm a therapeutic horticulture instructor, and got a degree at the University of Edinburgh.
Oh, brilliant.
So it's been a lot of fun,
Yeah.
shifting perspectives. So
Good.
I'm working for nature and helping people see nature through new eyes. So sorry that was a long version.
No, that's fine.
That's lovely. Thanks for sharing that with us. That's really nice to understand what you're doing.
Mhm.
That's that's fabulous. Yeah, I think the picking up on the pot idea, the sinking a pot in, I think that's great, isn't it? Or using just a pot, something small to bring water into the garden. I think that's something that's quite easy to replicate, whatever
Exactly.
size
Yeah,
pot size
absolutely.
place
Absolutely.
you
You
have.
shouldn't get too worried that you have to have a big pond
Yeah.
to be able to have the right things. And I've done quite a lot of, getting plastic pots and things and sinking them down or whatever you can get hold of,
Uh,
and doing it like that. And they've always worked very well.
great.
Uh,
That's great.
and just having that water in the garden really is an important part of the whole sort of habitat, really. Very
Yeah,
important, you know.
absolutely. Especially when we're doing so much in towns to drain water away from ground. We don't have, so many places where naturally
No,
that might occur. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And it's so important that all our outside spaces all add up. They're all part of one bigger green corridor often. That's really important, especially now we have so many buildings, so many more buildings going up outside of cities and so on, that if we can encourage wildlife in, it's beneficial.